Now that we have our sidebars set up, we could look at how to convert them into widget areas. And this is where the term sidebar may be a little bit misleading, because when we say register sidebar, what we're really doing is registering a widget area, and any sort of widget can go into that. And even if we wanted to put it on somewhere else in our page, we would still be calling it register sidebar. So the terminology is a little bit older or not completely accurate for how widely scoping these can be used. But this is the main code that we're going to use for widget areas, and we are going to implement it in our sidebar. So it makes sense there, but I just want to say at the outset that it's not limited to just working in your sidebar, and you'll see how that is the case as we go through this. So always a good idea to start with the code reference, checking out what's going on. Register sidebar is going to take an array or a string of arguments. And there are a bunch of different arguments here. Again, a little bit tricky, I think, to see it in this way. So let's pop it open in a different view to take a look. So here is an example that we have where we are using all of the different parameters. So we have a parameter for name, which is going to be the name as it appears for us to use within our admin area. We have an ID of it. This is how we're going to reference it in our template and say, hey, put this actual widget area or sidebar, dynamic sidebar area here. A description, which makes sense. Before and after the widget. So before the widget, what do we want to appear? Do we want a div with a class of widget? Do we want a section? And you can see before widget and after widget are filled in there. We can also add a custom class if we wanted to, and before title and after title. So the general format of these widget areas is that you've got your section, then you've got your title, and then you've got whatever is in that actual widget area appearing there. So these are the different parameters for register sidebar. Helpful to know. Check this out on your own. Just look through it till it begins to make a little sense. The next thing up is active sidebar. Now this isn't exactly needed, so to say, absolutely, but it is something that's really helpful. And what this will do is we could pass in either an ID, a number, an integer, or a string. We could basically say, hey, main sidebar, are you active? Can I use you? Are you set up properly in the functions.php file with that register function and have stuff going on in there? And if it is, then we'll know that we can go ahead and display it. And if not, then we could back out and not get any potential errors from trying to display something that's not there. So the last one that we need, this is just going to be a conditional tag that we run, is dynamic sidebar. And this is where we pass in the actual name of the sidebar that we want to get. So what we set up in this first one by saying it's going to be unique identifier, so ID, but we call that pretty simply, not seeing a reference to it here, but we'll look at it in a second in the code, and that's just going to pop out our widget area, and you'll see just how simple it is and how powerful it is, because now you could use widgets, which are great. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so let's start off in our functions.php file and come down under our menu locations, and this is where we will set up our widget areas. And I'm going to call them widget areas because I think that better describes what they are as opposed to just sidebars, but that's up to you how you want to name that. And I'm going to create a new function called WP hierarchy. Remember, all of our custom functions were namespacing in this way, which basically just sets them apart from being jacked up by something else that comes along. And I'm saying widgets init. So init, if you're not familiar in programming terms, refers to initializing. And in general, it's a name that means setting up or getting something started. So that's pretty applicable here, I think. And then we have to hook into WordPress. Again, we haven't looked at hooks in depth, but we do need a few of them. And there's one called widgets init. And this is going to run. There's a certain point when WordPress is building your page out that it says, hey, let me find out all of the widgets that are set up. Well, as part of that process, it also has to check and see what widget areas are set up. So that makes sense that when WordPress is setting up its widgets and finding out what's available, we want to look in and say, hey, don't forget about me. I've got a widget that I want to create. So inside of this whole function, and after we set up this whole framework, we can register our sidebar, and we could actually register tons of sidebars. So you'll see as we go through this that we could do multiple ones, like you could have a ton of different ones in here. So this general wrapper will load all of them. Now, how do we want to set this up? We can do something where we create args and create it that way like I showed you in the past. I'm going to show you in this example how to just pass the array directly. So it's going to take a number of things. First of all, it's going to take a name. Let's give ourselves a little bit more room. And this is where we're really using a lot of these template tags that we haven't really talked about in depth. But again, I've explained what this does. The difference between escape underscore and E is going to be one echoes it out, one just grabs it and saves it. And since we are kind of just assigning it here, we don't want it to be echoed out into the page. That would break things. So we're going to call this main sidebar. And whenever we do this, we do have to add in our namespace for our theme. The next thing that comes up is the ID. And we're going to call this main sidebar. ID does not have to be a number. It could be, but I think strings are a little bit easier to tell what it is, especially when you're in a theme. You could tell what's going on there. So I'm just going to indent this a little bit. The coding standards like to keep things clean. So for description, we'll say escape that HTML, and we'll say add widgets for main sidebar here. Whatever message you feel is appropriate, and just so I don't have to type that anymore, I'll go ahead and paste that in. I'm going to toggle off the display here just so we can see everything on one line. The next thing we have up is before widget and after widget. So before widget, we want to set up a section tag. And you could do it differently. Some people use divs. I'm just going to use a section with a class of widget. Okay, pretty straightforward. And then we could do after widget as well. And that is simply going to be where we close out our section. Now you could put in multiple things here, like it doesn't have to just be one HTML tag. Like if you wanted to do a div inside of that, just make sure that you then close it out here in the after section. Now, you might be wondering, why would I use these options versus hard coding it? Remember, in our header, we hard coded nav as opposed to entering it in via parameter. And there's more flexibility when you enter these in as a parameter, because I could programmatically, or you could learn to programmatically change these before and after settings via your functions.php file without having to edit the actual markup. So anytime that you could pass that markup through the template tag, etc., then that's just going to make it a little bit easier, potentially, or it's not necessarily going to make it easier. It's going to make it more flexible in terms of how you could customize it. So now we've got before title. We'll make that an H2 with a class of widget title is pretty common. And then the last one down here, after title. And we'll close out our H2. That's a lot of typing, but we now have a sidebar set up. So if we ever wanted to repeat this process, you could just copy this block of code, paste it down here, and create a new sidebar area by customizing those things. So we have a sidebar set up. So if I were to come into my widgets here, I could see main sidebar as one of our widget areas, and that is great. If we wanted to add a custom one, we could do that as well. So now that we've got all this working on the back end, let's come in to our actual template, which I guess is still the back end, but it's a little bit more front end than everything that we're doing in this setup process here. So if I come now into my sidebar, here is where we're going to start customizing a little bit of what we have going on. Now, the first thing may not make a lot of sense, but it is a best practice, and I'll try to explain why it is that you see this code. So what you often see at the top of your sidebar is the use of isActiveSidebar, and then whatever sidebar it is that you're checking. So in this case, we have our main sidebar, and we're saying, hey, is this not active? So remember, when we're checking conditional statements, the use of the exclamation point means not. So if we did this, it would say, hey, if this is active, go ahead and do this. So what this is saying is if main sidebar, which we set up in our functions.php file, is not set up, then we simply want to return. And what return does in a PHP file like this is it stops right here. It never gets to all this code. So even though it's on the page, if this sidebar isn't present, it's not going to display any of this. And the reason is because what comes after it may be something that depends on that code and will break and throw an error. So inside of this place here, we can now safely assume that we can load our dynamic sidebar of main sidebar. And it's a few steps here, but now you can see it's pretty simple. Most of the work comes in setting up and determining what you want to do there. But now we're going to say, okay, on our sidebar, if it's active, go ahead and display it. And let's see what happens. Let's look at this through the customizer. We can see, maybe are we still doing our splash one? If we come into our index, still got sidebar splash. Let's remove that. Okay, so nothing's happening there. Let's come into our customizer, go into widgets, and add widgets for the main sidebar. We can see we're in the main sidebar here. And let's just add a simple text widget. Cool. So that's working. You can now work with this just like you would any other widget area. Super powerful, super helpful, and really makes sites better. When you learn this little bit of code, you can now code a much more customized site that will let the user edit widget areas wherever they want. And you could duplicate this process wherever they want as well. So let's go ahead and save this and talk about the next steps. At this point, what you've got to do is follow along, implement what you've learned here, and now in your theme, I really want you to do something different. Go ahead and create one sidebar and put in a widget area there, but throw widget area down into your footer. Maybe throw a custom widget area into your splash top page so that someone could customize a message that would display if that is there. So try putting widget areas in more places than just your sidebar.php. Again, try putting one in your footer, try putting one in the header, try putting one in the sidebar, and get really good at this because it's definitely going to make you able to code more flexible sites that are easier for people to update. So go ahead and take that challenge, work all that out, and then in the next lesson, we're going to come back and finally get our actual loop up and running. We've got all of our framework. We've got the whole rest of the page good to go. Let's take care of this main content area here.